Imagine a cool autumn morning, the kind where the air feels crisp and the world is painted in golds and reds. You're walking along the edge of a quiet forest, the leaves crunching beneath your boots. When out of the corner of your eye, something moves. It's quick, a flash of fiery orange darting behind the trees. You stop, heart racing. What could it be? A fox, perhaps? Wild and free. But then, you notice something unusual. This fox, unlike the others, isn't running away. It's watching you, curious, its bright eyes locked on yours. This is where our story begins. In a small town nestled at the foot of a sprawling forest, a young woman named Emily lived a life that was simple, yet full of a quiet kind of magic. She'd grown up exploring the woods behind her house, always feeling a deep connection to the wild animals that called it home. But she never expected to befriend one. Not really. Not until the day she met him, the fox who came home. This wasn't just any fox. There was something different about him. Something almost human. His eyes seemed to understand things in a way that wild animals usually don't. At first, Emily thought it was just her imagination, that she was reading too much into a chance encounter. But day after day, the fox would return, watching her from a distance, never fully approaching, yet never quite leaving either. Curiosity got the better of her, as it tends to do. She began to leave little scraps of food near the edge of the forest, hoping to lure him closer just to see him up close. And slowly, cautiously, he accepted her offerings. Each day, he came a little closer, until one afternoon he did something that took Emily completely by surprise. He followed her home. This was no ordinary wild animal. He wasn't behaving like any fox she'd ever seen. The way he trotted behind her, cautious but determined, made it seem like he had made a decision. He had chosen her, just as much as she had chosen him. But what did that mean? Was it safe? Could she trust him? And more importantly, could he trust her? The lines between human and animal began to blur in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. As weeks passed, their bond deepened. Emily started to notice the fox showing up at her house, sometimes sitting by her door as if waiting for her. They had developed an unspoken understanding. She would leave her door cracked open, just enough for him to sneak inside when the nights grew colder. But as much as she was fascinated by her new companion, a part of her couldn't help but feel uneasy. Wild animals weren't supposed to behave like this. They were supposed to fear humans, to keep their distance. Yet here was this fox, curled up on her porch as if he belonged. Rumors started to spread through the town. Neighbors would whisper about the strange sight of a fox following Emily around like a pet. Some thought it was charming, others not so much. Some even warned her that foxes could be dangerous, that she was playing with fire by letting him get so close. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this fox than met the eye. And then one evening something changed. Emily had left the door open just as she always did, but this time the fox didn't come. Hours passed and the night grew darker, colder. She stepped outside, calling for him softly, but the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Worry gnawed at her. Had something happened to him? Was he hurt? Or worse, had he decided to return to the wild for good? Just as she was about to give up hope, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whine coming from the edge of the woods. Her heart leapt into her throat as she hurried toward the sound, flashlight in hand. And there, just beyond the tree line, she saw him. But he wasn't alone. Standing over the fox was a shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light. Emily froze, fear gripping her. Who was this? And what did they want with her fox? Before she could react, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods, leaving the fox lying there, injured and weak. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she knelt beside him, gently lifting his limp body into her arms. What had happened? And who was that in the forest? As she carried him back to her house, one question echoed in her mind. Was this friendship worth the danger that seemed to be lurking just out of sight? But that's the thing about bonds forged between the wild and the human world. They're never simple. Emily carried the fox inside, her mind racing as she gently laid him on a blanket by the fire. His breathing was shallow, and his fur was matted with dirt and a few spots of blood. She didn't know much about tending to animals, but she knew he needed help. And fast. Grabbing a warm, damp cloth, she began cleaning his wounds, all the while wondering who or what had hurt him. The mystery of the shadowy figure in the woods lingered in her mind. Who would harm an innocent animal like this? And why had they been so close to her home? The forest had always felt like a place of peace to Emily, a sanctuary where the lines between her world and the wild one blurred. But now, there was something darker at play. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her, someone who didn't want her to befriend this fox. As she worked, the fox stirred, his eyes fluttering open for just a moment before closing again. A wave of relief washed over Emily. At least he was alive. But as she cleaned his wounds, she noticed something strange. A collar. Hidden beneath the thick fur around his neck, a thin, weathered strip of leather was barely visible. It was old and worn, as if it had been there for years. The discovery made her pause. Was this fox someone's pet? Had he belonged to someone before he wandered into her life? The idea felt unsettling. She had always thought of him as wild and free, but the collar suggested a past she hadn't imagined. Who had he belonged to? And why was he out here alone? Emily couldn't help but feel a deep sense of responsibility now. This wasn't just a fox. He had a history. A story that she didn't yet know, and it seemed like someone, or something, was connected to that story in ways she couldn't understand. The collar was a clue, but it only deepened the mystery. Who had left him out here, and why had they hurt him? As the hours passed, Emily kept a close watch on the fox. She fed him small amounts of water and food, hoping it would give him enough strength to recover. The house was quiet. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of the leaves outside. But that quiet was unsettling too. She couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the woods. Could they be watching her even now? Days passed, and slowly the fox began to recover. His wounds healed, and his strength returned, though he still seemed wary, his eyes constantly flicking toward the windows, as if he too sensed the danger lurking outside. Emily tried to go about her life as usual, but it was impossible to ignore the growing sense of unease. Every time she stepped outside, she felt like she was being watched. Every rustle in the trees, every distant sound in the forest made her jump. The townspeople had started to notice too. Emily could feel their eyes on her when she walked through the market, whispering behind her back. Some people thought she was foolish for taking in a wild animal, while others were outright hostile, warning her that foxes were dangerous, that she was asking for trouble. But Emily couldn't abandon him now. She felt a deep connection to the fox, as if they were somehow tied together by something larger than either of them understood. One afternoon, while Emily was gathering firewood near the edge of the forest, she came across something unexpected. Half buried in the leaves was an old, rusty trap, one of the kind used by hunters to catch wild animals. It had been sprung, but whatever had been caught in it had long since freed itself, leaving only traces of fur and blood behind. Her heart sank. Could this be what had hurt the fox? Had he been caught in a trap like this, struggling to free himself? But the more she thought about it, the less sense it made. The figure in the woods. They hadn't just been there by chance. It felt deliberate, almost as if they had been watching, waiting for something to happen. Could the trap have been set on purpose? Could someone have been targeting the fox? Emily's thoughts spiraled. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something darker was happening here, something she didn't fully understand. She started spending more time with the fox, keeping him close, as if by protecting him, she could somehow protect herself from whatever was lurking in the woods. But the more she tried to shield him, the more the outside world seemed to press in on them. One night, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled softly, Emily sat by the window, watching the trees sway in the darkness. The fox lay curled up at her feet, his eyes half closed but alert. Suddenly, a noise outside caught her attention. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but then it grew louder, a steady rhythmic tapping, like something tapping against the side of the house. Emily's heart raced. She stood up slowly, peering out into the night, but all she could see was darkness. The tapping continued, relentless, like someone, or something, was trying to get her attention. She moved closer to the door, her breath quickening. Should she open it? Should she see what was out there? Before she could decide, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving. Emily stood frozen, her hand hovering over the doorknob when she heard it again. This time, a soft rustling sound, like something moving through the leaves. The fox lifted his head, his ears pricking up as he too sensed the disturbance. Emily's hand trembled as she pulled the door open, just a crack. The cold night air rushed in, and for a moment, everything seemed still. But then, just beyond the porch, she saw it. Another figure standing at the edge of the trees. It wasn't the same shadowy figure she'd seen before. This one was smaller, less menacing, but still, there was something off about it. It was a child. At least that's what it looked like in the dim light. A small figure, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing barefoot in the cold, their eyes wide and unblinking. They didn't move, didn't say a word, just stood there watching her. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she stared back, unsure of what to do. Why was this child out here, alone, in the middle of the night? And why did they look so strange? She stepped outside, her voice shaky as she called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" But the child didn't respond. They just turned and slowly walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness without a sound. Emily stood there for a long moment, her mind racing with questions. Who was that? And why were they out here so close to her home? Something was very wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on what it was. As she closed the door and returned inside, the fox's eyes met hers, as if he too was wondering what they had just witnessed. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things that didn't make sense. And as Emily sat back down by the fire, the feeling of being watched lingered, stronger than ever. Something was out there lurking in the darkness, waiting. Emily couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of the child standing at the edge of the woods haunted her. It didn't make sense. Why would a child be out there alone and barefoot in the cold? And the way they had disappeared into the darkness without a word, it wasn't normal. Nothing about this situation felt right. The fox seemed unsettled too. He paced near the door, his eyes constantly darting toward the window as if he sensed something that Emily couldn't see. She had always felt a deep connection to the forest, but now, for the first time, it felt like a place of danger, like something was closing in on her from the shadows. The next morning, Emily decided to head into town to see if anyone had reported a missing child. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Maybe the child had wandered too far from home and gotten lost. But when she asked around, no one knew anything. In fact, no one in town had seen or heard of a child matching the description she gave. A few people gave her strange looks, as if they thought she was imagining things, but Emily knew what she had seen. On her way back home, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched again. It was subtle at first, just a prickling at the back of her neck, but it grew stronger as she neared the edge of the woods. She quickened her pace, her heart racing. Was someone following her? She glanced over her shoulder but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling persisted, gnawing at her nerves. When she finally reached her house, the fox was waiting for her on the porch. His tail swished nervously, and he seemed more anxious than ever. Emily knelt down beside him, running her hand gently over his fur. "It's okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to reassure, him or herself. But things were far from okay. That night, the strange tapping sound returned. It started just after dark, faint at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Emily stood by the window, her hand hovering over the curtain, afraid to look outside. She didn't want to see whatever or whoever was out there, but she couldn't just ignore it. Summoning her courage, she pulled the curtain aside and peered into the night. The tapping stopped, and the woods seemed still. But then she saw it again. Movement, just at the edge of the trees. This time it wasn't the child. It was the same shadowy figure she had seen the night the fox had been injured. They stood motionless, their face obscured by the darkness, but Emily could feel their eyes on her. The sense of dread that had been building over the past few days hit her full force. Who was this person? Why were they watching her? And what did they want with the fox? She slammed the curtain shut, her heart pounding in her chest. Panic gripped her. She couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering when they would strike. She needed answers, but she didn't know where to start. The next day, Emily decided to search the forest, hoping to find some clue that might explain what was happening. She ventured deeper into the woods than she had ever gone before, the fox trotting at her side, his eyes alert. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, but underneath it all there was something else, a sense of foreboding, like the forest was holding its breath. As she walked, Emily's thoughts turned to the collar she had found on the fox. She had almost forgotten about it in the chaos of the past few days, but now it seemed more important than ever. The collar was old, worn, and weathered, but it had once belonged to someone. Had the fox been someone's pet? And if so, what had happened to them? After hours of searching, Emily came across something that made her stop in her tracks. A clearing in the forest, hidden from the main trail. In the center of the clearing was an old, crumbling cabin, its windows boarded up and its roof sagging with age. It looked abandoned, like it hadn't been touched in years. But there were fresh footprints in the dirt outside the door. Her heart raced as she approached the cabin, the fox close at her heels. The air around the cabin felt thick with tension, as if it was holding on to secrets long buried. She pushed open the creaky door, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The cabin was empty, but the walls were covered in old, faded photographs. They showed people, families, children, and foxes. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the pictures. There was something unsettling about them. The foxes in the photos looked just like the one that had followed her home. Wild, yet strangely connected to the people in the pictures. And then she saw it. A photograph of a child, the same child she had seen outside her house that night. They stood beside a fox, their small hand resting gently on its head. Emily's mind raced. What was this place? Who were these people? And why did they have such a close connection to the foxes? Before she could process it all, she heard a noise outside, a rustling in the trees. Panic surged through her. Was someone coming? She hurriedly backed out of the cabin, her heart pounding in her ears. She needed to get out of there fast. But as she turned to leave, she saw them again. The shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing, watching her. This time they didn't disappear. They stood still as if waiting for her to make the next move. Emily's breath hitched in her throat. She wanted to run, but something in their posture stopped her. There was something almost familiar about them. The fox growled low in his throat, but he didn't move. He, too, seemed torn between fear and recognition. Emily's mind raced. What if this figure was connected to the fox's past? What if they held the answers to all the questions that had been haunting her? She couldn't run, not yet. Not without knowing the truth. Summoning her courage, she took a step forward. The figure remained still, their face still hidden in the shadows. Emily's voice trembled as she called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" For a long moment, there was no response. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick with suspense. And then finally the figure spoke, their voice low and steady. "He doesn't belong to you." The word sent a chill down Emily's spine. She opened her mouth to respond, but the figure was already gone, slipping back into the forest as silently as they had appeared. Emily stood there, frozen, the weight of their words sinking in. The fox nudged her leg as if urging her to leave, but her mind was spinning. Who was this person and what did they mean? Did they know the fox? Had they been the one who hurt him? Or were they trying to protect him from something or someone else? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered as the tension in the air grew thicker. Something was coming. Something that had been building for days, and Emily could feel it closing in around her. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what was about to happen, but she knew one thing for certain. The fox's past was catching up to them, and the truth, whatever it was about to be revealed. Emily stood in the clearing, her heart pounding as the figure's words echoed in her mind. "He doesn't belong to you." The forest around her seemed to press in, the weight of the mystery tightening like a noose. The fox remained by her side, but everything felt different now, more dangerous. Who was this person? And what did they mean by those words? The air was thick with tension, as if something unseen was watching her, waiting for her to make a move. She couldn't stay here any longer. The sense of danger was overwhelming, and her mind was a blur of unanswered questions. Emily turned, moving quickly back through the woods, the fox at her heels, until her house came into view. But even there, the feeling of safety had evaporated. The familiar walls felt fragile, like they could no longer protect her from what was coming. That night, Emily sat in her living room, the fire flickering softly as shadows danced across the walls. The fox lay at her feet, his eyes closed but his ears alert, twitching at every sound. She couldn't relax, couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. What had started as an unusual bond with a wild animal had turned into something far darker, and she was caught in the middle of it. Her thoughts kept returning to the cabin in the woods, the photographs of people and foxes, and that strange child. None of it made sense. And then there was the figure, the one who had been following her, watching her. They clearly knew more than they were letting on, but why wouldn't they reveal themselves fully? As Emily tried to piece it all together, a sudden noise outside shattered the quiet. It wasn't the tapping from before, this was different. It was louder, more forceful, like something or someone was trying to get into the house. Her heart leapt into her throat as she rushed to the door. This time, when she opened it, the figure was standing directly on her porch. They were close enough that she could see the faint outline of their face, but the shadows still obscured their features. Panic shot through her, but before she could speak, the figure raised a hand, gesturing toward the woods. "You need to come with me," they said, their voice calm but commanding. Emily's pulse raced. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The figure stepped closer, and for the first time, Emily caught a glimpse of their face. A young woman, maybe only a few years older than herself, with sharp, intense eyes. There was something familiar about her, something that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. "I know what you've seen," the woman said, her gaze flicking toward the fox. "I know you found the cabin, but there's more you need to understand. About him, about what's really happening." Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to stay inside, to lock the door and never look back. But there was something in the woman's voice, something that told her this was the only way to get the answers she so desperately needed. She glanced down at the fox, who had risen to his feet, watching the woman with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Without another word, Emily grabbed her coat and stepped out into the night. The woman didn't wait for her to catch up. She moved quickly, leading Emily into the woods, deeper and deeper into the darkness. The fox followed close behind, his paws making barely a sound on the forest floor. After what felt like hours of walking, they arrived at another clearing, this one even more remote than the one with the cabin. In the center stood a tall, ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching up toward the sky like twisted fingers. Beneath the tree was a circle of stones, and in the middle of that circle something glittered in the moonlight. Another collar. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her ears. The collar looked just like the one she had found on the fox, only this one was newer, less worn. She knelt down, reaching for it, but the woman's voice stopped her. "Don't touch it," she warned. "It's a mark, a sign that they've chosen him." "Chosen him for what?" Emily demanded, standing up and facing the woman. The woman's expression was grim. "For something much bigger than either of us can fully understand. These foxes, they're not just animals. They're part of something ancient, something that's been happening for generations. And once a fox is marked with a collar like this, they're bound to it. To the people who wear them." Emily's mind raced. "So, this fox, he belonged to someone?" The woman nodded. "Yes, and now they want him back." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Who are they?" The woman hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "They're a group of people, some say a cult, who believe the foxes are connected to the forest's power. They think the foxes hold the key to unlocking something ancient and dangerous. They mark the foxes with these collars to bind them, to control them. And once a fox is marked, it can never truly be free." A chill ran down Emily's spine. "But he's not with them anymore." "He's with me. For now," the woman said, her voice low. "But they've been watching you. They know where he is, and they'll stop at nothing to get him back." Emily's head spun. None of this seemed real, but at the same time it explained so much. The strange behavior of the fox, the figure watching her, the feeling of being followed. It wasn't just her imagination. She was caught in something far bigger than she had realized. "What do they want with him?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. The woman's eyes darkened. They believe that by controlling the foxes, they can control the forest itself. They think the foxes are the key to accessing some kind of ancient power, something buried deep within the woods. And they'll use whatever means necessary to get it. Emily's stomach twisted. What happens if they get him back? The woman's gaze flicked to the fox, who stood silently beside Emily, his eyes fixed on the circle of stones. If they get him back, they'll use him to complete their ritual. And once that happens, there's no telling what they'll be able to do. Emily's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The fox wasn't just an animal, he was part of something much larger, something dangerous. And now, they were both caught in the middle of it. The stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined, and the thought of losing him to these people, to whatever ritual they were planning, sent a wave of fear crashing over her. She looked at the woman, desperation in her voice. "How do we stop them?" The woman's face was grave. "We can't stop them, not completely, but we can try to keep him safe. We can try to keep him hidden, but we don't have much time. They're already closing in." Emily's heart pounded as she realized the full weight of what the woman was saying. The conflict wasn't just about her bond with the fox anymore. It was about something much bigger, something ancient and dangerous that had been brewing for generations. The stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined, and the clock was ticking. But one thing was clear, she couldn't turn back now. The fox's fate, and possibly her own, hung in the balance, and she would do whatever it took to protect him, even if it meant facing the darkness that was closing in around them. Emily's heart raced as the woman's words echoed in her mind. "We don't have much time." She looked at the fox, his amber eyes glowing softly in the moonlight. His fate, it seemed, was far more intertwined with the forest than she had ever imagined. And now these people, this cult, were closing in, ready to reclaim him for their own twisted purposes. Without another word, the woman motioned for Emily to follow her deeper into the woods. The fox padded alongside them, silent but alert. The forest felt alive, as if it, too, knew that something monumental was about to happen. The branches above creaked, the wind whispered through the leaves, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble with anticipation. Emily could feel it, the pulse of something ancient and powerful just beneath the surface. They walked for what felt like hours, moving further and further from the safety of Emily's home. The trees grew thicker, their trunks knotted with age, and the air around them seemed to hum with energy. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every rustle in the bushes made Emily's pulse quicken. She knew they were close to whatever it was the cult wanted, and close to something far more dangerous. Suddenly, the woman stopped. They had arrived at a place that looked almost otherworldly. A massive stone stood at the center of a clearing, its surface covered in strange, ancient symbols. The moonlight illuminated the carvings, casting eerie shadows across the ground. Around the stone, small fires burned, casting a flickering light that revealed figures moving just beyond the tree line. "They're here," the woman whispered, her voice low and urgent. "This is where it happens." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The figures, there were at least a dozen of them, emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured by hooded cloaks. They moved in unison, circling the stone, their movements methodical and precise. In their hands, they carried strange objects, knives, bowls, and something that looked like an ancient scroll. Emily's body tensed as she realized what was happening. This was the ritual. The cult had gathered here to complete whatever dark ceremony they had planned, and the fox, her fox, was at the center of it all. The woman grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her behind a tree. "You need to listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice urgent. "Once they start the ritual, it will be too late. They'll bind the fox to the forest, and the power they seek will be unleashed. We can't let that happen. But if we move too soon, they'll see us. We have to wait for the right moment." Emily nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt helpless, trapped in a nightmare she didn't fully understand. But one thing was clear. She couldn't lose the fox. Not like this. The cult members began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, filling the air with an eerie, almost hypnotic sound. The fox stood still, his body tense, as if he knew he was at the center of it all. Emily's hands clenched into fists. She wanted to scream, to stop them, but fear kept her rooted to the spot. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward. Their hood fell back, revealing a face that Emily recognized instantly. It was the child. The same child she had seen in the woods, the one who had appeared outside her house. But their face was different now, older, more intense, as if they were no longer a child but something far more ancient. The child raised a hand and the chanting grew louder. The other cult members moved closer to the stone, their eyes fixed on the fox. Emily's heart raced. This was it, the moment when everything would change. But then something happened. The fox, who had been standing so still, suddenly moved. He turned toward Emily, his eyes locking onto hers. There was a sadness in his gaze, a kind of understanding that made Emily's heart ache. And then, without warning, he leaped into the center of the clearing, his body moving with a speed and grace that took everyone by surprise. The cult members froze, their chanting faltering. The child, now revealed to be some kind of leader, stared at the fox, confusion and anger flashing across their face. Emily knew this was her moment. Without thinking, she rushed forward, the woman close behind her. The cult members didn't seem to notice her at first, their attention fully on the fox. But as Emily reached the stone, one of them turned, raising a hand to stop her. Before they could act, the woman leaped forward, tackling the cult member to the ground. "Go!" she shouted at Emily. "You have to break the circle." Emily's heart pounded as she reached for the stone, her fingers brushing against its cold surface. She had no idea what she was doing, but instinct took over. She grabbed the collar from around the fox's neck, pulling with all her strength. For a moment, it felt like nothing would happen, like the collar was too tightly bound. But then, with a sudden snap, it broke free. The moment the collar fell to the ground, the air around them shifted. The chanting stopped, and the cult members froze as if something vital had been severed. The fires around the clearing flickered, then died out, plunging the area into darkness.
The leader let out a scream of rage, their voice echoing through the trees.
"You've ruined everything!" they shouted, their eyes burning with fury. "The power was ours! The forest was ours!" But it was too late. The connection between the fox and the cult had been broken. Whatever ancient power they had sought to control was gone, slipping through their fingers like sand. Emily stood there, breathing hard, the broken collar in her hand. The fox looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something deeper. The woman stepped forward, her face grim but relieved. "You did it," she said quietly. "You stopped them." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was short-lived. As she turned to leave, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The stone in the center of the clearing glowed faintly, as if something had been awakened deep within it. The woman's eyes widened. No, this can't be happening." Before Emily could react, the stone cracked, a jagged line running down its center. From the crack, a blinding light burst forth, illuminating the entire clearing. The cult members screamed and scattered, disappearing into the forest as the ground shook violently. Emily stumbled back, the light nearly blinding her. The woman grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the stone. "We need to get out of here," she shouted. But as they turned to run, the fox hesitated. He stood in front of the stone, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the light pouring out of the crack. Emily's heart stopped. Something was wrong. The power, the very force the cult had been trying to control, wasn't gone. It was being released. The fox took a step toward the stone, his fur bristling. Emily realized in a flash of horror what was happening. The fox wasn't just connected to the forest's power, he was the power. The collar had been containing it, keeping it dormant. And now that it was broken, the power was being unleashed. "No!" Emily screamed, rushing toward him.
"Come back!"
But it was too late. The fox leaped into the light, his body disappearing into the crack in the stone. The ground trembled one last time, and then, with a deafening roar, the stone exploded into pieces. Emily fell to the ground, her vision swimming. When she opened her eyes, the clearing was silent. The stone was gone, reduced to rubble. The fires were out, and the cult members had vanished. But the fox? He was gone too. Tears filled Emily's eyes as she knelt on the ground, her heart aching with the weight of what had just happened. The woman stood beside her, silent, her face unreadable. "He's part of the forest now," the woman said softly. "He always was." Emily stared at the empty clearing, her heart heavy with grief and wonder. The fox was gone, but in his place something new had been set free. Something ancient and powerful, beyond anything she could fully understand. Emily knelt in the clearing, her heart still pounding in the aftermath of what had just happened. The silence around her felt heavy, almost suffocating. The forest, which had once felt alive with hidden energy, now seemed eerily still. The fox, the one who had come to her, the one she had grown to care for, was gone. It was hard to process, to accept that he had become something so much more than a wild creature who'd wandered into her life. He was part of the forest now, bound to the ancient power that released. The woman stood beside her, watching the trees with an expression that was hard to read. Emily could feel the weight of everything she still didn't know. About the cult, about the power the fox had carried, about why all of this had happened. The questions swirled in her mind, but in this moment she was too tired, too overwhelmed to ask them. She just wanted to breathe, to try and understand the loss she was feeling. She wiped her eyes and stood up, her legs shaky beneath her. The woman looked at her, a mixture of sympathy and something else. Something almost like respect. "Is it over?" Emily asked quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman nodded. "It's over for now. The power that was released, it's back where it belongs. The forest will keep it like it always has. And the cult, they've lost their chance." Emily looked around the clearing, still half expecting to see the fox emerge from the shadows, but she knew deep down that he was truly gone. "I didn't know this would happen," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want this. I just wanted to help him." "You did help him," the woman said softly. "More than you realize. The bond you shared with him, it was real. That's why he chose you, why he trusted you. You kept him safe when no one else could." Emily swallowed hard, trying to keep the tears from spilling over again. "But I couldn't save him in the end. I lost him." The woman's eyes softened. "You didn't lose him, Emily. He chose this. He knew what he had to do. The power, it wasn't something he could escape. But you gave him something no one else could. Freedom. And that's something no collar, no ritual could ever take away." Emily let the woman's words sink in. She wasn't sure if they made her feel any better, but they did offer a sense of closure, a way to make sense of everything that had happened. The fox had been more than just a wild animal. He had been a guardian of something ancient and powerful, something that neither of them could fully understand. And in the end, he had done what he needed to do to protect the forest, even if it meant leaving her behind. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Emily thought she heard a faint, familiar sound, a soft yip, like the fox was still somewhere close, watching over her. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the forest air fill her lungs. "We should go," the woman said quietly. "There's nothing more for us here." Emily nodded, though she found it hard to turn away from the clearing, from the place where everything had changed. But she knew the woman was right. There was no more danger, no more threat. It was time to leave the forest behind. As they walked back through the woods, the night felt quieter than it ever had before. The weight of the mystery, the fear that had followed her since the day the fox appeared in her yard, had lifted. There was a strange peace in knowing that, even though she didn't have all the answers, the forest had returned to its natural order. The cult's plans had been stopped, the power had been released and contained, and the fox had found his place within it all. When they finally emerged from the trees and reached Emily's house, she felt a wave of exhaustion crash over her. The porch light flickered softly, casting a warm glow over the front yard, and for a moment, everything felt like it was back to normal. But Emily knew better. She wasn't the same person who had wandered into the woods all those days ago, and the world wasn't the same either. The forest, the fox, the ancient power that had been hidden for so long, it had all left its mark on her. The woman turned to her, her expression serious but kind. "You'll be okay," she said. "The forest will watch over you now." Emily gave a small, tired smile. "What about you?" The woman shrugged slightly. "I'll be around. There's always more to watch, more to protect. But this part of the story, it's yours now." There was something about the way the woman said it. Like she had seen this happen before, like the cycle of the forest's power was something that had played out many times before and would continue long after Emily was gone. It was comforting in a strange way, knowing that the forest was ancient and powerful and had its own way of balancing itself. "Thank you," Emily said, unsure of what else to say. The woman had been a stranger, then an ally, and now she felt like someone Emily would always remember, even if she never saw her again. The woman nodded once, then turned and disappeared back into the trees, her figure blending into the shadows until she was gone. Emily stood there for a moment, staring at the place where the woman had vanished before turning and heading inside. The warmth of her house enveloped her, but the quiet felt different now, less lonely, more reflective. She glanced at the spot by the fireplace where the fox used to curl up, feeling a bittersweet pang in her chest. He had left her life as suddenly as he had entered it, but she knew she would carry the memory of him with her forever. In the days that followed, Emily found herself thinking often about the fox, about the strange events that had unfolded, and about the power that still hummed deep within the forest. She went back to her normal routine, but everything felt subtly different. The forest no longer felt like just a backdrop to her life. It was alive, filled with secrets she would never fully understand, but had grown to respect. Sometimes, late at night, she would step outside and listen to the wind rustling through the trees, half expecting to hear the soft padding of paws on the ground. And though the fox was gone, she felt his presence in the quiet moments, as if he was still out there, watching over the forest he had given everything to protect. And in those moments, Emily understood something she hadn't realized before. The fox had come into her life for a reason, and though their time together had been brief, it had changed her in ways she couldn't fully explain. She had been part of something bigger, something ancient and powerful, and that connection would always be with her. The forest, too, would always be there, its trees whispering secrets only it could keep. And though the cult had been stopped, Emily knew that the balance of the forest was fragile, always shifting, always vulnerable to those who sought to control it. But now she was part of its story, and she would protect it in her own way, just as the fox had. And so, life went on. The seasons changed, the leaves turned and fell, and the forest continued to thrive, its secrets hidden beneath the surface. Emily didn't see the fox again, but she didn't need to. She knew he was there, part of the woods, part of something far greater than either of them had ever imagined. And in the end, that was enough.